Okay, welcome to the second of our Australian native bee segments. The first one was with Graham Sanders in Townsville, and I'll put a link to that at the end of this video. But today we're speaking with Dean Bryant, the owner of Brymac Native Bees, situated in Peachester, here on the beautiful Sunshine Coast. Welcome aboard, Dean.
Yep, thanks.
Dean, we might start off with, as I did with Graham in Townsville, just give us some background about native bees. I mean, and I might say up front, we're dealing with a natural resource here, and
That's right.
They're intriguing little creatures, but why did you get involved in native bees, and for how long have you been involved?
Right. We sort of started when we bought the blueberry farm here 15 years ago. It was, well, just before that, about 15 years ago, when I first started looking at the flowers of the blueberry, we noticed that, I noticed that the native bees were basically 1,000 to 1 to the Euros. And on subsequent research, it was discovered that our natives are the best pollinators for our blueberries. And we were actually producing twice the amount of the industry standard of blueberries produced per bush because of the natives. So it all started from then, and it took off like a rocket.
They're fantastic. It seems like once you have one, you want to have more. It's like ice cream, isn't it?
It is. They're a very addictive little insect. And this is what we've noticed over the 15 years that we've been studying and working with the natives. Once people have a hive, they want more and more, and it just doesn't stop.
Yeah, and it's probably worth right up front in saying that while there are some general accepted practices to maintain Australian native bees, there are also different variances with each person who looks after, because, as I said, they're a natural resource and they change over time and things change. So would you agree with that?
I would, yes, I do agree with that. And we've evolved, we keep evolving to sort of a better practice. Like once upon a time when we boxed a hive of bees, everything went into the box. So the stores, leaking honey, everything. And it was such a disaster. How bees ever survived back then, I don't know, really. And this is why we had drain holes in the boxes. We used to tip the box forward to let the leaking honey run out. Now, the pest we have, it would be a disaster if we did that. So we've had to evolve over time with the industry.
So just talking about, and we'll get back to some of that when we talk about rescues later on. We'll get back to talking about what actually goes into boxes. But the South Queensland environment, I know, talking with Graham, that he talked about a limited amount of slumping up there because of the temperatures. I mean, we're a bit colder down here, but so what's the environment like down in the southeast Queensland area, and which are the bees that we have down here?
The most common bees we have here in the hinterland and all the way down to Caloundra sort of thing are Tetragonia cabrinaria, TC for short. But we have seen a big increase in the hawking side as people have brought them into the area, and they took them into Brisbane. And as everyone knows, they're very rampant in Brisbane. I've noticed areas that on the Sunshine Coast now that are predominantly TH, which used to be TC. So these are one of the drawbacks, basically, of taking bees out of their climatic zone.
Now, Graham talked about, he has a version that we've got northern Hawkins eyes and southern Hawkins eyes. What's your feelings on that?
I'm still on the fence. I've seen his arguments and his but I'm on the fence for that one. I still think they're the same species, but they've just evolved slightly different for the environment.
Let's talk with the view of making boxes for these Australian native bees to live in. So what's your theory about what's the best box? And does that change from, say, making a box for an Australis to a TC or a Carbonara?
Yeah, boxes vary quite a. Well, I've seen quite a few variations in boxes. I've always looked at nature for my answers. I like nature. We're biodynamic farmers, so we use nature to our advantage. We grow soil. We don't grow plants. It's the soil's job to grow the plants. So it's all about the biodiversity on the farm as well. Whereas sorry, I forgot what I was going back to. The boxes, yes. As I've opened probably 300 logs now of native bees. I do them in workshops. I do them for people that say they're clearing their block or they're building a house and they have a tree stump there. So I go and rescue the bees before the site's dozed and they're removed. And so I rescue them that way as well. Looking at the logs that I've done, anything that's sort of 50 mil thick in timber, the bees do exceptionally well, and they don't put a lot of insulation around the inside of the cavity, and they have a lot more room to build brood. Right. Whereas the thorns have got a lot of pollen, especially on the sunny side, and some of them can be 2 to 3 inches thick of pollen, and that's their insulation to say, that it's too hot for us. So they're trying to insulate their hive. So I've always looked at nature as to the size of the timber that they use. And being 20 years ago, I seen Russell's boxes, Russell's Abel. He was always making his out of cypress pine, and the bees were doing extremely well in it. So I started making mine as a copy of his. They've slightly evolved. They've slightly gotten bigger in size and volume. Due to the rescues that we were doing, the birds didn't fit into the box. So they've evolved as well over time. But I do believe in that they should only ever have an empty cavity in a box. This is what they have in a tree. This is what they're used to in nature. That's the way they build exceptionally well in nature. And I've never had an issue with just an empty box.
So your theory is that really 50 mil, some 40, 50 mil, the thicker the better the box is going to be. I mean, Graham had a theory about hardwood as opposed to pine. He said, look, once you put a hardwood box in place, it's there for life.
That's right.
Do you have a preference on hardwood or softwood?
I use white cypress predominantly. I've used white cypress for 15 years. I make, I buy enough timber to make 200 boxes at a time. And they usually last me about 6 months. I go through about 200. So, and I've always made them out of cypress pine, which is it's classed as a softwood, but it's really a hardwood. Yep. So it's one of those in between sort of ones. It has a very long lasting. It lasts performance wise exceptionally well in nature or out in the weather. Yep. And it's termite resistant.
So what about support bars and also roofs? What's your theory on support bars and roofs in across the board with these hives?
I always recommend a shade roof and a sort of like a rain roof to keep the extremes off the box, of course.
Yep.
We want the bees to be comfortable. Where we find the bees in nature, in trees, where every time we see them in nature, they're always in a shady area of a tree. They've chosen sites very, very well in nature. Yeah. Not so much in water meter boxes, but they don't have a lot of choice because they've taken all the trees away.
I take it because, sorry, just to butt in there, I take it because they're in water meters and plastic enclosures in the ground, that the ground itself becomes their insulator.
It does very much so. And 90% of these you'll always find in a shady area. You'll never find bees in a water meter in full sun. They just don't like it because you'll have meltdown, even though you've got the insulation. The plastic very, very hot and it'll melt the hive. So, you know, they suffer meltdown from that. I've seen it happen when they've tried to move into a couple of water meters and given up. You know, that split bars, I don't split my hives. I'm a big believer in induction, which is the way they propagate in nature. So we take advantage of that. As splitting, you know, if people want a hive split, I will split it for them, but I won't guarantee they're both going to survive, even though I know what I'm doing. And that's just the nature of the beast, you know.
So you're in preference to the induction or budding system.
Yes.
So you don't have any thoughts on, say, split boxes and horizontal boxes as to whether one of those is better than the other?
No, I've actually got a vertical split box with Cassii in it, this Australiba Cassii, which was when they first made them, they were a magic idea. I thought they were a very good idea, and Alan has a very good. He's exceptionally well because he always breeds. He breeds the Australiba australis.
Australis, yep.
A lot of the vertical split boxes. Now, I've found with the Australiba species, they do much better with brood lifts. So the vertical split boxes are basically, you know, not required anymore either.
Yep. Okay. So, okay, let's move on to, so you're in favour of the budding method or induction.
Yep.
What are the 5 key points when someone wants to do that? What's the 5 things that they've got to make sure they do?
Yep. Number 1, the mother hive must be chock-a-block full in that box. There can be no room whatsoever in that box, and the brood needs to be at least 200 millimetres high. They usually build them around about 120 to 125 mil around, and if it's 200 millimetre high, you'll be able to induct that box within 3 months.
Right.
You know, that's the way the bees work. You know, they're looking. Once they get to that size, they're looking to start a new daughter colony. So this is why we take advantage of that.
Right. And the counting of bees as well, that's all part of that process, in and out?
Well, that's not really a good indication, I've found. What I've worked on a box that was suffering brood collapse disorder. So it was in a zone where there was predominantly palm trees. And they're very addicted to the palm tree pollen. So these bees collected pollen way too much. They ended up filling most of the brood box with pollen. So there was less than a tennis ball size of brood left in that box, which it should have been, you know, extremely big in that box.
Yep.
It was Russell Zabel's boxes, so it wasn't the box's fault. You know, it had the thick wall, so it had nothing to do with insulation for the bees, and everything to do with the palm trees. And what happens is they keep on storing more and more and more pollen, and they can't get rid of it once they put it in the hive. So it takes up more and more room, and it ends up being it compromises the size of the brood, and it can't sustain the hive. Now, even at that point, there was still numbers by, you know, you would think that by the numbers coming in and out of that box that it was a very strong active hive and it had a very big brood. But the story the box told a very different story, you know. Yeah. So it's not a very good indication of how well the box is actually doing. View panels are imperative in boxes. All my boxes have view panels, and I maintain that people should have view panels on their boxes so they can see inside the hive and what's going on at all times without compromising the hive.
Yep. So in that brood lift, do you actually lift the queen as well, or do you leave the queen, or how does that work?
No, I use a certain section of brood, and I want a cross hatch of a cross section of brood. So basically all the bees that are going from that have just laid all the way through to hatching. So, and because the AAs build their brood as a ball in and out, it's very easy to take a spoon and lift that out. With AA especially, because the brood is loose, it's not tight together like TC or TH. Right. With TC and TH, they don't do brood lifts very well. Eductions work better. Yep. Eductions work with AAs or the Australebas, so that's why we do the brood lifts. Yep. You know, each species to their own sort of system,
to their own devices. So
yep.
let's talk about the connection between the mother hive and let's call it the daughter hive, the new hive.
Yep.
Is that critical? Length and colour and all that sort of thing?
It needs to be dark. I always use the black 13mm irrigation tube. I've never used a T-piece between them. A lot of people do. But because my hives have view panels, I've never needed a T-piece to allow the bees to escape. Yep. And I have the vent holes underneath the boxes as well. So what the bees do is if they ever need, if something happens to that connection between the boxes and they seal it off, they have the vent holes as an escape hatch. So they can always escape out of the mother hive if they need to. Whereas the connection, sorry.
That's probably your wife saying, bring home the milk.
Oh.
That's okay. That's okay. Look, this is marvels of modern technology. It just thrown in to give us a challenge. And is it right to say that once you have done one budding exercise, that the next budding exercise, whether it be sort of 3 months, 6 months, whatever, is a better exercise and happens again well?
It is. It's like we sort of train the bees. Like it's a bit hard. Like it's as if the queen. This is my theory. The queen steps up her game. So the scout bees that are telling them what's going on with the new apartment, the scout bees come back and they tell the queen and the bees that that they've got the new apartment and we need to provision it and we need to.
Hello, you've called Dean and Helen. Please leave a message after the tone and we'll call you back as soon as you can.
Sorry about that.
All adds to the chaos. Yes, sorry, mate. So they get. It's a bit. I suppose it's a bit like them getting used to the GPS hole that always come back to. It's the training of that. So if they're trained to walk through another box and this is a good place to put some stores, they'll put it in.
Yeah, so the theory that we've sort of got, that I've come up with, is the queen, once she starts stepping up her game to provide, it's like once they start a daughter colony, it's as if it's ingrained in them and they just keep on doing it over and over and over again. I've got one box there that I've had for 15 years. It's never been opened, the box itself. It's been in that same Zabel box actually for 15 years, and it can perform 4 eductions a year. I've had one that was complete in as little as 8 weeks. I couldn't believe that, Well, it was ready in 4 weeks, but I left it 8 weeks just to make sure. It was incredible. It shocked me how quick it actually worked. But that indicated to me that they were waiting to go. They were ready to start, set up another home. And we see these come to fighting swarms. We see people with fighting swarms, and that's a colony, say a wild colony, that's close by, that is at that stage, and they want to set up a daughter colony. And the scout come across this hive and thinks, well, that's a good home. So then they start, and that's where they go back and they tell the rest of the bees that, they've found a new home. And then the swarm comes over and you get the fighting swarm happening. Right. We can capture those too now by what we do. We trick the bees into won the war and we swap it with a bait box. and it's just so we you know it's people used to lose, like, you'd still get a hive after a fighting swarm, but there'd be thousands and thousands of dead bees on the ground, a carpet of dead bees. Now, you know, one or the other is going to win the war. So either the hive that's there is going to win the war, depending on the size, or the hive coming in is going to win the war. So either way, there's still going to be a colony in that box. Yeah. But why lose a colony?
Yeah,
we swap
exactly.
Capture, we save the original hive and we capture a new hive. So you get free bees.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that splitting a hive, and I tend to agree with you. It's a bit of a destructive exercise, but at the same time, it can be successful. But at the same time, I'm trying to compare that with lifting brood out of one box to seed another. It's a similar sort of process. I might just show a couple of photographs of the different brood structures that we will probably be talking about.
Sorry, you there? Someone was trying to ring on my phone then.
You're a wanted man. So
yeah.
no problem. So that difference between the splitting and the lifting, I suppose it's more of a subtle process, isn't it?
It's all depending on species as well.
Yeah.
Whereas 90% of the time, the hives that are split are TC and TH, because they're very the way they build and the way they fill the boxes is very good for that sort of process.
Yep.
AAs take a little bit longer to sort of fill. They're not as they don't build as quick. They don't have as many the numbers either. So you know, the vertical split with the Australibas worked really, really well. But it's much slower, I feel, than brood lifts.
Yeah.
So that's where we've gone with the brood lifts with AA, because it's a little bit quicker in producing hives than waiting for them to fill both of these boxes to be able to vertical split. Yeah. So that's basically where I am on that.
Right. Well, let's talk about rescues. I mean, that's a process of really destructing one cavity to put them into another cavity, whether it be out of a water meter or out of a log. You know, there must be set times when you can do it to the best of the ability for both parties concerned, both the bees and you as the new owner of the hive. So let's talk about rescues. What are the main things to do when you're doing a rescue?
So we don't do them during winter unless it's an absolute emergency. Mm-hmm. So sometimes a tree lopper will drop a tree and it'll explode and there'll be an exposed hive. That needs to be rescued. We don't actively go out and do any rescues, try and do rescues during winter. We try and get people to wait until it warms up in spring. It's our bees are fussy. They want it to be over 20 degrees. They stop sort of moving around 16. So we want them to be active and moving and to be able to work the hive and fix the hive. Now we remove all the stores. We try and remove the stores without getting leaking honey. So it's a very delicate operation and it takes a bit of time. You've really got to take your time and be
gentle,
be in how you're removing them. So as soon as you get leaking honey, you're getting drowned bees. So you can wash the bees off, but you still lose a lot of bees. Yeah. So we try not to lose bees. We try to save as many bees as possible. It's all a numbers game.
So it's transferring brood as well as a little bit of pollen, or no pollen?
I leave all the stores out of the box. I only transfer the brood into the box, and then the stores are left outside the box in strainers for the bees to access over the next 3 or 4 days. Now they rebuild their stores very, very quickly. In 3 and 4 days, they could have enough stores to last them 2 weeks, just from what they've foraged from the leftover stores that I've put out. So that's what I prefer the bees to do. If I put any, with the pests we have now, with the fire-root fly, the fire-root fly is the worst, by far the worst. It's a tiny little fly and it flies straight past the guard bees and in the hive. Now, if there's any pollen in there, any leaking honey or whatsoever in that box, it attracts the flies to the box straight away. I'd rather attract them. I'd rather they go for the stores than they go for the box. Much easier to fix them up when they're in the stores than it is in the box.
Sure.
So yeah, and the bees do. They're very, very efficient in collecting some of those stores and putting it back in the box.
Right. And you believe that when you're opening up the log, it's more of manipulating the log to be open rather than the discourse of just carving it in half.
Yes, you cannot. No, that's the major thing with logs. You cannot breach that cavity with the chainsaw. So, and I try and I explain this when I'm doing the workshops as well. The chainsaw is basically to assist to get you to the point where you can split that log with block splitters without damaging the internal contents of the cavity. Once we breach the cavity where the bees are with the chainsaw, it's all over. We've got leaking honey. You cut through the brood. You could kill the queen. It's a disaster. Yep. So this is why we try. We've developed best practice where the chainsaw is only used to assist us in opening the log.
Right, Dean. We're going to run short of time, but maybe we could conclude on hive placement and also moving a hive. So, what's your theory there?
Yep. Now you can move. I prefer putting them in full sun during winter, even if I do have shade covers on them. I can take that shade cover off every morning and let them warm up, of a cold day, and then put it on of an afternoon so they don't get the bad afternoon sun and it retains the warmth. The boxes, the cypress is very good at retaining that warmth over winter. With summer, they need to be in full shade. Mm-hmm. So again, the shade cover works for that. I've got too many hives out there, conditions where they're going to survive, and this is the reason for the boxes as well. The way the boxes are built, so they're made so they're safe in these all climates,
Yep. What about movement?
3 and up to 45. So that's why I've always maintained the size that we have here.
Yep.
Moving a hive, if you want to move a hive 10 metres, it needs to be done half a metre every 2 or 3 days, because their GPS is too damn accurate to that spot, that hole in the box. If you move it half a metre sideways, they'll go back to that point where that used to be and say, oh, okay, there it is, and go over there. Yep. If you want to move it an easier way, if you want to move it 10 metres or from one side of the house to the other side of the house sort of thing, lock them up overnight when they're all home, take them to a friend's place over 1 clay away, let them out, and they reorient at that new position. Yep. Once they've been there for 3 weeks, most of the foragers have dropped off and there's new foragers come up after that, because they're only foraging the last 2 weeks of their life. That's when they're expendable. Mm-hmm. So if they don't come back, no loss to the hive. And then once they've been there for 3 weeks, we lock them up again overnight, and then you can move them over to wherever you want on the property, and they reset their GPS again. So it works really well. I've locked them up inside for 6 days at the very minimum, and that's worked as well. So there's a couple of different options to do.
Once again, it's like what we talked about at the start of this segment, is that there's some accepted practices, but we as individuals, with dealing with our native bees, vary some of those practices.
We do, yeah. Yeah,
All right, mate.
that's right.
I really
People-
appreciate your time.
Sorry?
I really appreciate your time. I'll provide all of your details at the end of this video for both myself and others who are going to watch it to make contact with you. Appreciate your time. You're certainly passionate about Australian native bees, and
It is.
look after yourself in Peachester.
Yes, thanks.